Hello everyone, so let's talk chapter 4. So in chapter 4 we're talking about knowing what to do. And in talking about knowing what to do, we're talking about the possibilities for users to make mistakes. So we learned that we are more prone to messing up or making a mistake, or we make mistakes more often when there's more than one possibility or more than one option for things to do. And so when we consider this, we've talked in the past about putting constraints on ourselves in terms of what we design, so the constraints that we face. In this case, we're going to be talking about putting constraints on our users. So knowingly putting constraints into a design that makes it more usable, which seems kind of counterintuitive, but that's essentially what this chapter is talking about, and that's what this video is going to be about. So let's look at our different types of constraints that we have. And the book talks about 4 different primary types of constraints. Physical constraints. Physical constraints are your standard limitations. These are the things that we've talked about before. And physical constraints are limitations for us as web designers that we do not want in our websites at all, really. These are physical limitations, things that are stopping us from physically accessing things. So in that sort of way, these are barriers that we need to break down. However, the other 3 of our 4 types of constraints we can introduce into our designs. Semantic constraints are limitations based on the meaning of the situation. So what this means is that, there are certain things that you have to include in a system in order for it to function. Like if you're making a mirror, for example, and you're going to mount this mirror in a box and hang it up on the wall, we have to have the mirrored surface facing outward so that it can be functional. For it to have any kind of meaning. And that's what semantic constraints are. These are things that you have to do because they're necessary for the situation. And we'll give another example about that in just a moment. The next one are cultural constraints. These are limitations based on an accepted cultural convention. So, for example, if you are making something that needs to be read, we talked about this in a previous video about how we read things, even though we talked about it in relation to mapping content. How we read things is a cultural convention. We read things in English differently than people read things in other languages. Our alphabet is meant to be read from left to right. Some Arabic alphabets, for example, are meant to be read from right to left. Japanese kanji are read from top to bottom. So these are cultural constraints in that when we are writing text, we write it in a way that it can be read. Or, for example, think about a stoplight and put a pin in that for a second, because we'll get back to that with another example that covers several of these in just a moment. And then finally, we have logical constraints. These are logically induced limitations. Limitations just because they're things that make sense. You know, if you're designing a desk and you put the chair part facing one way and the desk part behind it, that's illogical because nobody can use that. You know, if you're building something and you have a set number of pieces, all the pieces should be used with no gaps. You know, everything should be included. So when we're thinking about a website of that nature, if we have a bunch of content that has to be included, then these are logical constraints because we have to figure out a way to include all of this information in our website. So we have to be able to map all the information properly. We have to be able to include it there in some sort of hierarchy. And we have to be able to put all of it in there in a way that makes sense. So those are logical constraints. And we can take semantic constraints, cultural constraints, and logical constraints and put them together into one example that your book discusses. And that's the concept of the Lego motorcycle. So when we're talking about logical constraints for a Lego motorcycle, you're given a set number of pieces when you sit down to start to build. And you know that all of these pieces together make a Lego motorcycle. So if you end up with leftover pieces, or you end up with gaps in your design where it looks like there should be a piece, but there isn't one, then you know something's wrong, because logically, the logical constraints state that all of the pieces have to be used, and the end result has to look like a motorcycle. Then when we're dealing with cultural constraints in regard to the Lego motorcycle, think about the taillights on the Lego motorcycle, or the taillights on your car, or anything of that nature. When you're building the Lego motorcycle, you have the red lights, the red light pieces in your pile. And you know that the red lights go on the back. Because culturally, red is a color that means stop. That's something that we've ingrained into society. That goes back to that knowledge in the world stuff we were talking about in the last chapter. That's knowledge in the world. Red means stop. Our stop signs are red. Our stop portion of our stoplights are red. So if we have a red light that's supposed to go on our Lego motorcycle, we know that we want to put it on the back for other drivers to see it so they know to stop their cars or stop whatever they're driving before they hit our motorcycle. So these are cultural constraints in action with the Lego motorcycle. And then semantic constraints. So when you have a rider driving this motorcycle, they have to sit facing the road. So you know that the seat can only go one direction because they have to be able to see what's in front of them. So you want to put the seat facing forward. And also because of that, you want the windshield to be able to protect the face of the driver. So you know that if the seat has to face forward, the driver has to face forward to look out to see what's ahead of them. Then in order to protect the face of the driver, then the windshield has to go on the front. That's a semantic constraint. In order for that windshield to be meaningful, in order for that windshield to have an impact on the operation of the Lego motorcycle and reach its intended goal of protecting the driver's face, then it has to be in the front. Hypothetically, you could put a windshield anywhere on a motorcycle, especially a Lego motorcycle where all the parts are interchangeable. But unless you put it on the front, it wouldn't have the intended impact. It wouldn't have meaning in the situation. So that's a semantic constraint. So in that sort of way, constraints can be good. And we want to add constraints to our design in order to make things more usable. Because we're able to bring good mapping to a situation through limiting action. Because remember, we went back to the first of this video. People are more likely to mess things up, or mess things up more often, when there are more options or possibilities of things to do. So when we put constraints into our design, we're one, feeding into the knowledge in the head and the knowledge in the world by employing our logical constraints, our cultural constraints, and our semantic constraints, but we can also add in some constraints that limit the options of the user in what they do, so that, in essence, what we're doing is we are suggesting what the user should do through limiting constraints. So if you only put one button on a page for the user to click, they only have one option of things to click. They're limited in their motion, they're constrained by what they can do on a page, but they know exactly what they should do because of the limited options. And in saying that, we don't need to make them deceiving. These constraints that we put in still need to have affordances. So if you have that one button on the page, it still needs to look like a button, or it still needs to have some kind of signifier saying that it's clickable. You know, that gives one predictable outcome. So if it's clear, with affordances, with visibility, it's easily seeable. You know, you have that full system image that we've talked about before. So it's highly visible, and you give feedback based on what the user did, even though they only have one option of things to do, or one or two options of things to do. Even though their options are very limited, you still have to give them feedback on what they did to let them know that what they did was a success. Because in the environment, you know, we kind of know that things can go wrong. You know that websites can go on the fritz. You still need to give them that feedback. So even if they only have one thing that they can do, enter in their email address, click send. You still need something to say, thank you for sending your email address, to let them know that it works. So if we limit the possible actions through constraints, wrapping things up, if we limit the possible actions through constraints, we limit the opportunity for our users to make mistakes, which will lower the level of frustration, which will in turn create a better user experience. And so this is talking about preventing errors to a degree. The next chapter looks even further at human error and what we can do with it as designers. And again, that's something we'll talk about more in Chapter 5. Thank you for watching.